thinking, and it kind of makes me think about, we got to go back to Billings for Thanksgiving, which is, I don't mean to rub it in if you didn't get to spend time with family. I get that this was a tricky one. But one of the things that I love about spending time with extended family, especially extended family that you don't see all that often, is just the moment of looking in the mirror that it is. You know what I mean? Like, and sometimes that's funny and comical, and sometimes that's horrifying. But there's these moments where you're like, oh, I do that. Oh, and I do that. And oh, I do that. Sometimes it's good, and I know that I grunt and groan every time I bend over or pick something up, or there's this thing that I do all the time, and it's pretty subconscious. But then when I watch my dad open the oven or something, I'm like, why do you have to make all those noises? You're just bending over. And I hear him, and then I go, oh yeah, remember Grandpa Bill did that? And there's this thing that we do. And then there's also those reaction things that we do, right? Like I throw everything away, my dad throws nothing away. So hopefully you had one of those experiences this week, or you get to some point this season. All that kind of reminds me of what excites me about this series that we're jumping into, and that's because I think my opinion is, and I guess you'll get to decide over the course of the next few weeks whether or not you agree, but my opinion is that we're going to look at the 16 chapters in Jesus' Bible that maybe were among the most weathered. And of course, some of that's obviously a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Jesus didn't own a Bible. The printing press hadn't been here yet. But one of the ways that I think we can really go about understanding Jesus is to go, what were the pages in his Bible that he paid the most attention to? What are the stories that most influenced him? And I really think this is one of them, which is where I'm excited to jump into all of this, because there are so many claims about God and ideas about God. And I don't think we necessarily have to solve all those, but for me, there's something refreshing about going, but here's what Jesus thought, and here's how Jesus related. And we did a series a couple of years ago where we just said Jesus was a stinking, astounding person, and that's kind of the way I come at this thing of, you're probably a lot like me in that you can probably come up with thousands of reasons to not be a Christian. But for me, there's lots of good reasons to be a follower or apprentice of Jesus, because he's just such an amazing person. So there's this friend that I've been walking with figuratively and literally. No, I think it's all figuratively. We don't go for walks. But there's this friend that I've known now for years. And a couple years ago, I felt really honored. He started to disclose to me that he was kind of struggling within his faith. And here's somebody who's been a part of local churches his whole adult life. I'm guessing he's in his 50s-ish. I asked his permission to share this anonymously, of course, but he just started to share that there were some struggles. And of course, one of the first things that you've got to pay attention to in yourself and in others when this is going on is, are those struggles convenient, right? Tony Campolo years ago rather bluntly said that when a student shows up in his office, and Tony Campolo was a professor at an undergrad Christian school called Eastern in Philadelphia, he used to say when a student would show up in his office and say, I don't believe anymore, he would look at them and say, who you sleeping with? Which maybe you don't agree with his sexual ethics. I know that's a little bit blunt, but his point was this, and I think this stands even if you don't agree with his sexual ethics, is that if we're not careful, we oftentimes rationalize our behavior through our beliefs. And so I think that's an important process to go suddenly I don't believe, is there something else going on? And in the case of my friend, as best I can tell, that's not what's going on. In fact, there were a couple crises for my friend. He'd watched a couple people die, one way too young of cancer, another it just didn't seem right. And frankly, I think part of what he had experienced, and I think it goes all the way back to when William Paul Young was here years ago, some of the cover on the way he read the Bible was getting removed, that he was starting to ask these bigger questions of what if Noah wasn't a historical person? And to me, it's not important that he was or wasn't. I can have fun with that conversation either way. It's not my agenda there, but I think my friend was starting to kind of see beyond the teaching that he had received most of his Christian life, and it was starting to mess with him. Well, I had this opportunity to be involved in that conversation with him, had shared many resources with him, even some books, had conversations, tried to be a good listener, asked some good questions, and frankly, kind of got to share what for me are the important answers to some of his struggles. And yet it was an ongoing conversation. And then a couple months ago, we got together for drinks, and again, my point isn't to solve the problem for him, but I also, there's been this importance of going, hey, I want to stay near in the midst of your asking these questions, because I think one of the things that we can do is assume that because we're changing our beliefs that therefore we're out. And so just wanted to be a good friend to him, mostly continue to listen and ask questions. And in that meeting, he summarized things for me in a way that was among the best ways I've ever heard it summarized. He said something like this. He said, Adam, I think the issue for me is I'm in. Like, I'm an insider. Like, I believe. I get it. And so therefore, when something like someone dying young of cancer happens, or when I stumble into something in my Bible that suddenly I'm going, wait a minute, that's not the way my Sunday school teacher taught me that. He said, I can rationalize it. From the inside, I can make sense of it enough to keep myself in. He said, but for me, the issue is when I'm sitting on an airplane and the person next to me who's not in asks these questions, I don't feel confident enough in my convictions to actually help it make sense for him or for her. Like, as an insider, I can do it, but as an outsider, more or less what he was saying is I could just see where this stuff is just absurd, and I couldn't do that for them. So with his permission, I said, well, here's the deal. I have a meeting with my friend Dr. Delamarter. Many of you have met him. He spoke here a few times. He's now the retired Old Testament prof from what was then George Fox Seminary. Now it's Portland Seminary. And what I love about Dr. Delamarter is he's very much a scholar, one of a few people in the country who spent extensive time with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is now working real extensively on these Ethiopian manuscripts and kind of collecting everything they can find and doing some real kind of nerdy scholarly work in that regard. His wife is a PhD researcher for Oregon Health and Science University, which is kind of the Harvard and Yale of medical research. So he lives in the Bible world and the Jesus world, but very much in the science world. In fact, some of you remember last time he spoke here, he has the record for longest sermon. He spoke for almost an hour. Anyway, so I trust him. I love listening to him. And I said to my friend, I said, hey, I've got this Zoom meeting with him in a couple of weeks. We just meet a few times a year. He's the only person that I've Zoomed with in a very long time. I mostly tried to avoid it. I said, do you mind if I just ask him that question? I would love to hear his response to the question. And my friend was like, sure. So meeting came. I posed all of that, everything I just shared with you, to Dr. Delamarter. And he said, here's the deal, Adam. Here's my understanding. Is your friend has moved beyond stage one faith. And he referenced a guy named Fowler, which you may or may not have heard of before, but he's done some research around faith. And really what Fowler says is there's several different seasons of faith that a person can experience. And he's not in any way saying that everybody does or that one stage is better than the other stage, but just recognizes that faith tends to work differently in these different stages. And some people move into them and some people don't. Some people think Mother Teresa was ultimately an atheist when she died because she was in what I think he calls stage 6 faith, which the other perspective would be, no, she wasn't an atheist. She just was in this different season of her faith. But he said, I think what's happened is your friend has moved beyond stage 1 faith, where everything is as it's been told to him and everything's very black and white, and the Bible falls in line with the evangelical tradition that he's been raised in, and so on and so forth. And he said, here's the issue, Adam. His innocence, and I loved the phrase he used. He said, his innocence is gone. Like what happens in this season is you really want faith to work for you the way it used to work for you, but it'll never work that way again. And he said, when people lose their innocence in their faith, most people leave. And he went on to explain that for many of us, we're so entrenched in this idea that if it doesn't work this way, it's not the real thing. And in many church traditions, that's the way it's taught, that their option is either to pretend, to play along, to fake it, or just to leave. And then he said, but the hard work, and this is the work we did, I think, in this series called Help My Faith is Evolving, where we celebrated our 10th birthday around this. But he said the hard work is to do the work of making sense of your faith in this new season. And then he said this, he said, really what's going on is your friend, he's going to have to admit to himself that we all interpret the Bible, that we all do that. And then he said, and in fact, he said, even Jesus interpreted the Bible. And then he used another phrase that for me, I hope I carry because within the specificity of language and the value of that, I find this to be a good one. He said, part of what we have to recognize is even Jesus had a canon within the canon. Now, that's kind of nerdy, sophisticated language, I suppose, but when I say canon, we're not talking like shot from a ship. We're talking about this process that the historical church went through by which they vetted certain letters for the Bible and certain letters outside the Bible, and there's all kinds of research around that, and we can have conversations there, and you can listen to the History Channel, which will take you one way, and you can read other scholars that will take you another way. But his point wasn't so much to stir up canonization in general, but to say that even Jesus, I think the way we would say it is even Jesus played favorites in the Bible. Even Jesus had certain sections of the Scriptures that he really identified with God in that section of Scripture, and other sections that, frankly, we don't ever hear him referencing. Now, the extent to which that's true, that's what excites me about this particular series, is because what I want to do is spend it, and I had to bring my nerdy Bible this week just because I didn't have the prep time I would normally want, and there's some notes that I want. But really, what we get to do, in my opinion, is look at 16 chapters from what would have been a part of Jesus' Bible, that I think the more we lean into these, and really the bulk of this will be next week, you begin to gain this perspective of like, oh, because sometimes we act as though Jesus got himself killed because he came up with a brand new idea about God and what it means to follow God, and in his case, what it means to be God. But really, I think the story is Jesus paid attention to stuff that most of his contemporaries were ignoring. Jesus was highlighting and reading parts of his Bible that most people were ignoring, and he's going, no, this is who God is. This is what it means to follow him. And I think that to the extent to which that's true, what you see all the more is the gospel writers, especially the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, you see them using this section of Scripture. It's almost like post the fact they went, oh, it was there all along, but we missed it. And they extensively used this section. So, Isaiah 40. And if you decide to jump into this week, there's lots of ways you can do this in your own chair time. Isaiah 40 to 55 is, of course, a whole section. You can also Google the suffering servant songs. I believe there's 4 of them. And these in particular, guys like N.T. Wright would say, you want to understand how Christ understood himself, it's these songs. So let's just jump into 40. Comfort. Oh, comfort my people, says your God. One of the questions I think you have to start asking as you jump into this section is, who is this God and how does this God relate to his people? What is his disposition? When you walk in the door, how does this God think about and treat people? And one of the hints is, N.T. Wright would say, the theme of these entire 16 chapters is in the first word. A God who wants to comfort his people in the midst of their situation. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her. So you pick up on that this God is speaking to his people in a certain way. And part of the question that we have to ask then is, okay, is this normative? What's the big deal? Okay, so God's speaking tenderly to his people. And this is where we get into that Jesus had a canon within a canon. Because the other way to ask this is, are there places in Jesus' Bible, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures, where he could have went and found a God whose disposition towards his people was much different? Much more aggressive, much more angry, much more punitive? Of course there are. And this begins to get into, in fact, there's this sub-point here. The book of Isaiah, and this may be too nerdy for you, but I think this is important. The book of Isaiah, most reputable scholars, which of course that's a relative statement coming from me, most of the scholars I would trust, let me say that, are at this point acknowledging Isaiah doesn't have one author. Part of the issue there is the span of time that Isaiah covers is greater than what the person Isaiah, who was a historical person, than that person's lifetime. Most scholars today that I would trust are saying Isaiah has 3 or 4 authors. Now, whether those are apprentices of Isaiah or not, we don't know, but ultimately they get published under this one book. But the idea is there's 3 or 4 voices. And the reason why I think that's significant is even in the book of Isaiah, there's distinction between the voices. And if you go with this theory, the third voice, the third author, starts in chapter 40, and it's very distinct, especially from the first 2. Speak tenderly. Like the Hebrew there is speak from your heart, that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So question, is this God a God who's soft towards sin? Is this all about just permission? Is this a permissive God? Of course not. This God still takes seriously human brokenness, human sin, the consequences that often naturally come by way of that. But somehow this God is reaching out to a people, and he's with compassion and mercy and tenderness. Remember, this is a Jesus that we're referencing, who got himself in a lot of trouble. Why? Because he took such a strict line when he was in synagogue? Because he was so black and white at his treatment of people? Of course not. This brings to mind his treatment of tax collectors like Zacchaeus and Matthew, and prostitutes. Maybe Mary was one, we don't know. The woman at the well and her pain and her past, the woman caught in adultery. This is Jesus who had the audacity to touch lepers. This is the Jesus who, if he oftentimes, and I think this is the most difficult thing about being a modern day Christian, when Jesus said harsh things, it was often to people closest to him theologically, not furthest from him. Where does this come from? See, it's easy for us in the 21st century, steeped in Jesus, to take it for granted. But maybe part of the danger of denying the Old Testament or just ignoring it is we miss the fact that Jesus, he was playing what was a minor note and claiming, no, this is the major note of the story. He continues, a voice cries out in the wilderness. This may sound familiar to you because this is what the gospel writers use to describe John the Baptist. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord, this is the same word for tabernacle, then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed and all the people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Historical context here, of course, is that when you heard a king was coming to your city, they didn't come with like nice suspensions on their SUVs. They came in things like chariots and on horseback. They walked, or they were carried on people's backs in a way. And so the idea was when you heard somebody important was coming, you leveled the roads. You did everything you could to make sure that they were like as least grumpy as possible when they showed up at your doorstep. The modern equivalent is when you hear you're having guests over, most of us, you clean your house and you make it cleaner than it's ever been. Part of the reason why we struggle to have people over is there's this kind of false narrative that your house has to be perfect before you're going to have anybody over. But the message here is what? It's of a God who's coming back. Remember, these people were in exile. The historical context here is something we've explored all the way back from the start of COVID. These are a people who lost everything, all normalcy. Everything was gone. Many of them are in a foreign country. They're miles and miles away from Jerusalem. It's gone. The walls are gone. The temples are gone. The temple's gone. Everything in it is gone. Exiled people did not presume that they would ever return to their land, any more than you probably presume that you're going to return to Germany someday or wherever it is that your people are from. This is a God who's saying, I'm coming back. I'm coming for you. Why do the Gospels use so much of the Exodus narrative? Because this is a God who's fundamentally saying, I'm returning to you. Get ready for me. And this is a God that's revealing what about his disposition towards you? Is this a God that's soft on sin? Or is this a God that deals with sin differently than maybe the normal dominant voice of the Old Testament? And why does he pick up this section? Why is it so clear that he derives so much of his identity from this section? See, here's the piece personally why I love this section, and this has been for me a pretty invigorating process, though I worked through it a couple months ago. I don't think I'm that much different than you in the sense that if I'm not careful, I get overwhelmed by the number of God options. I mean, just nobody needs me to point out that like the number of options are a bit overwhelming. I think this is why college students can get so overwhelmed. It's why cities tend to struggle so much more with a traditional form of Christian faith and some of the false and true narratives that come with that kind of lifestyle occur. Why? Because suddenly you're just overwhelmed. We live in this global world, this multicultural, post-Christian world. The claims on God are myriad. And that's if we're just talking about kind of the big three, so to speak. And then even if you start working within Christianity, it can become overwhelming. Who is this God, and what is this God like? Well, what church are you going to go to on Sunday morning? And what book in your Bible are you going to read? And how exactly, what tradition are you going to pay attention to, the Catholic tradition or the Protestant tradition or the Eastern Orthodox tradition? Are you going to be someone who identifies with God predominantly through the scriptures or through the sacraments? I mean, it's overwhelming. It's kind of like Mr. Potato Head. This is the way I've been thinking about this. So I need someone who can count to roughly 30-something, okay? So I just want you to count the number of options that we have here. So this 1999 Amazon Mr. Potato Head, it used to all have to fit in his backside, right? But now it's like, no, we just send you a box. So I want you to count the total number of options here. So he came with 2 hats, so someone keep up with this math, okay? And 3 different noses, and I think there's six ears. See if I can, yep, there's 6 different ears, including lime green. Too bad that Snowhop is gone. They could have had their own Mr. Potato Head. And then two sets of eyes. So someone counting these for me? Okay, thank you. You're all like OCD and out. Stop talking, I'm trying to count. 2 sets of eyes, and I think there's 6 total appendages. Well, arms or legs also appendages? I'm not sure. So 6 sets of arms, or 6 total arms, not sets. And then there's 2, 3, 4 mouths, and more mustaches than a person should have. 4 mustaches, a microphone, 2 sets of glasses. Susie would be excited. Different colors, both ones. 2 tongues. I think this is an earring, though I'm not entirely sure. Fortunately, he's just a Levi and same pair of shoes guy. So 1 set of pants. So how many total is that? 34. Is anybody disputing 34? Okay, and then I'm going to argue you should also count the orifices, the holes, because technically his ear doesn't have to go where his ear goes. So, ready? So we got 3, 6, 9, 11 holes. How many holes does the human body have? Maybe we shouldn't think about that. Seriously, though, I wonder how many the human body has. Anybody, any medical people in here can tell us off the top of your head how many holes in the human body? Okay, so how many do we have now? Is that 46? 45? So, okay, mathematicians. So how many different variations are possible if you have 45 accessories and potential landing spots? Anybody? You have to get out your phone for this one, unless you're Einstein, and then even then, I don't think Einstein could do it. Because Scott, is this the 45 exclamation point thing? Is that how you do that mathematically? Putting you on the spot. Anybody? I think that's how you do it. Any math teachers? Isn't it 45 times 44 times 43? So anybody punch that into their calculator yet? Okay, so before I added the orifices, is orifice and hole the same thing? Before I added the holes, it was over 1 billion. Over 1 billion different options for one stinking Mr. Potato Head that costs $19.99. That's kind of the faith thing, isn't it? Like, there's so many options. Here for me is why I frankly get goosebumps thinking about Isaiah 40 to 55, and again, the meat of it we're going to really jump into next week, is because here's one approach. Here's my approach. Frankly, I don't feel like I have to rein in on or weigh in on all billion options. Here's what makes sense to me, is what I do get to do is I get a front row seat, and sure, there's still some subjectivity to it, but I get a front row seat to the way Jesus puts the pieces together. And I'm just willing to go all in, aren't you? On like, I know there's a million options, and frankly, it's not even important to me that I discredit all the options. It's just not important to me anymore. What is important to me is that I can go, but here's what I can tell you. I can jump into Isaiah 40 to 55, and there's other places in the Old Testament. Hosea is another one of those. And I can go, here's what's important to me is, here's how Jesus puts the pieces together. Here's how Jesus related to God. Here's how Jesus suggests we relate to God. Here's how Jesus understood what it means to be human and why we have a job. Next week, we're going to explore this whole vocation thing. That could potentially be enough. Doesn't have to be. Listen to the way chapter 40 wraps up. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right hand is disregarded by my God? In other words, these are a people who in a situation not altogether different than ours are saying, God can't, God won't, it's over. There's so much speculation around church right now. It's over, blah, blah, blah. God is over. These people are just going like, they're hopeless. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. If you spend some time in Isaiah 40, what you'll see is he directly addresses these four other options. Because part of what's going on here is he's claiming this God is not a local deity, he's cosmic king. And he unpacks some of the other ways that the Babylonians claimed there was power. And he goes, no, this God. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. There again is this God of comfort. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. It's a reminder to me that we're in a season of waiting. And in some sense, that's always true, and now it's just more real. And in another sense, it's uniquely true right now. But you step back and you go, why did Jesus get himself in so much trouble with so many people? Well, because at his core, it would seem, Jesus was identifying with this God. He was claiming rather definitively, I'm that God, and this is the way that God rolls. And he starts not from a place of anger and wrath, but from a place of compassion. So here's a potential way to carry this into the week. First of all, I think this is a way to honor God in this season that we historically call Advent is just to pray a prayer that sounds something like, God, is there a way that I'm relating to you or projecting you to others that frankly is not becoming of who you are? Because part of the Jesus narrative is a lot of people got themselves in a lot of trouble because they became married to an image of God. And we've talked about we all carry an image of God around with us. We're all constantly constructing one. They became unwilling to work and rethink their image of God. And frankly, they failed to account for the fact that this God has a profound character flaw, that this God does not balance justice and mercy. We've explored this in the past, but the book of Hosea seems to make very clear when it comes down to it, this God values mercy more than justice. I think there's this permission to pray this kind of search me, O God, and just point out, like, not as a way of just kind of beating your thumbs with a hammer, but a way of honoring God in your own growth in this season of God, is there a person that you would have me relate to differently than I currently am? Maybe more merciful. I also think if you're someone like my friend who's stymied and maybe just kind of perplexed by the whole thing, there's this permission to open up to Isaiah and just go, okay, if this is the God that Jesus identified with, who is this God? Because frankly, people like me and whoever else has influenced you with Christ, there's just no way of not tainting it and cheapening it. Open up to the Gospels. And that's not to say that everybody who reads them comes to the same conclusion, but nonetheless, what comes to the surface is a God who majors on things that oftentimes the church minors on, and who minors on things that oftentimes well-intended Christians major on. And maybe for you, just in this season, maybe it's just a reminder of you're not the first person who had to wait. Whatever it is you're waiting for, whatever it is, and maybe you're even ashamed to say it because it seems so trivial or so trite and it's so minor compared to the grand scheme of things. You're just one of however many billion. That the story is of a God who perpetually is faithful in the waiting. And then next week, I just really looking forward to jumping into what I think is the heart of it all. Let me pray and we'll sing and just give you a chance to process. God, Lord, thanks for your Son. Thanks that he was as much human as he was God. Thanks that he also, therefore, spent time reading Scripture and studying Scripture and sorting through the host of ears and noses and mustaches that he had to choose from and what he was going to put on you. And God, I get it. It's still the proverbial leap of faith to go, okay, I'm just going with Jesus' image. I'm going with his arrangement. And yet we thank you that we even have that option and the historical process that you've put in place, both by way of the church and the Scriptures, people, to kind of guard and protect that image. And yet, God, we all, whether someone who follows you or not, we're aware that the Jesus that we apprentice under and the one that we refuse to apprentice under, they're also not the spot-on perfect image of you either. And so if this was just a season of sharpening, just one thing or even just one relationship, we would invite you into that. We love you, Lord. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.